If you drive the ridge road above Caudill's Branch today, it takes you 11 minutes to pass from one end of the hollow to the other. The road is paved. There is a cell tower on the high knob and a church with a paved lot and a sign that lights up at night. It is an ordinary place, the kind you would pass through without a second thought. In the spring of 1889, that same stretch of ground took a grown man the better part of a day to cross on foot, and a preacher who tried to learn what the old men of that hollow were doing on the high knob at night did not cross it at all. He went up to ask his questions, and the people who answered him, one by one, stopped being seen. This is the story of those questions, and of the price the hollow charged for asking them. Before we climb, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I want to know the spread of you scattered out there in your lit rooms, because the man at the center of this story believed that the light of the gospel could reach any dark place, and he was wrong. And I think it helps to remember how many of us are listening from somewhere safe. By the time we reach the top of the knob, you will be glad your road is paved, and your church sign lights up, and your questions can be asked out loud. Caudill's Branch was a hollow in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, a place so folded into the ridges that even other mountain people considered it remote. In 1889, there was no road into it worth the name, only a footpath up the creek that flooded out for months at a time. There was no doctor, no telegraph, no resident law. The county sheriff, when asked years later why he had never investigated the things that happened there, said plainly that he had never once in his life set foot in Caudill's Branch and had no intention of starting. It was a closed world, governed not by the county and not even quite by the church, but by a small body of men the people simply called the elders. They were the oldest heads of the oldest families, and what they decided was law, and what they did on the high knob above the hollow on certain nights of the year was not discussed. Into this came the Reverend Ephraim Tull, 34 years old, a Methodist circuit minister of unusual stubbornness, assigned to bring regular preaching to the high hollows that had none. He was a stocky, plain-faced man with a farmer's build and a farmer's hands, broad and split-knuckled because he had been a farmer before he was called. His eyes were a flat dark brown, and they did not look away from things. People who knew him said he was kind and that he was relentless, and that those were the same quality in him. He came up the creek path into Caudill's Branch in March of 1889, intending to stay a season and start a congregation, and he kept a daily journal, and that journal, recovered later, water-stained and incomplete, is most of how we know any of this at all. It is held now in the archives of a Kentucky theological seminary under restriction, and historians who have read it describe it as one of the most unsettling documents in the collection. For the first weeks, the Reverend's journal records ordinary frustration. The people of Caudill's Branch were polite to him and would not come to his preaching. They fed him and housed him and answered his questions about crops and weather and would not answer any other kind of question at all. He wrote that there was a church building in the hollow, a real one, but that no one used it, and that the people seemed to worship somewhere else, somewhere he was not invited, on a schedule tied to the moon and the seasons rather than to Sunday. He wrote that the elders watched him. He wrote that the children of the hollow were the only ones who would speak freely to him, and that what they said frightened him more than the silence of the adults. A child told him about the knob. It is the first wrong thing in the journal, and the Reverend recorded it plainly. A boy of perhaps 9 told him that the men went up to the high knob on the dark nights, the ones with no moon, and that they took up what the mountain was owed, and that you were not to ask what that meant, and that the boy's own grandfather had gone up one autumn and not come back down, and that the family had not grieved him because, the boy said, Granddaddy went to be one of the ones the mountain keeps. And that's a fine thing, and we're not to be sad. The Reverend wrote that the child said this the way another child might explain a custom of his church, with no fear and no doubt, and that this was the thing that turned his stay from a mission into an investigation. A people who could teach a child that a vanished grandfather was a gift, he wrote, were a people who had made peace with something monstrous. So he began to ask, and this is where the witnesses begin to vanish. The first was an old woman named Loma Sturgill, who, the Reverend wrote, had stopped him on the path one evening and told him in a low voice that she had once seen what was done on the knob and that it was an abomination and that she would tell him everything if he would help her get word out to the county. They arranged to meet at the church building 2 days hence. She did not come. When the Reverend went to her cabin, her son told him, courteous and unbothered, that his mother had taken ill and gone to stay with kin over the ridge, and that she would not be back before winter, and there was no ridge kin and there was no illness, and Loma Sturgill was never seen in Caudle's Branch again. Nobody thought too much of it. People left the hollow. They went to stay with kin. It happened. But the Reverend thought a great deal of it, because Loma Sturgill had been about to talk and he wrote her name in his journal with a small, careful note beside it, gone the day after she spoke to me. And then it happened again. A young man named Drew Combs, who had been coming quietly to the Reverend's evening readings, the only adult in the hollow who would, told him after one such reading that he too had seen the knob, and that he wanted out, that he wanted to take his wife and leave before the autumn dark nights came, because he had been told it was to be his turn to carry up what was owed, and he did not want to. The Reverend wrote that he had never seen a man so frightened. He promised to help Drew Combs and his wife get down the creek path to the county. 3 days before they were to go, Drew Combs's wife came to the Reverend alone, white-faced, and said her husband had gone up the creek to check a trap line and had not returned, and that the elders had told her he had drowned in the high water, and that there was no body to bury and would be none, and that she was to understand that her husband had been honored. She left the hollow that same week, alone, and the Reverend's journal records that she would not speak to him again before she went, and that she would not meet his eyes, and that he understood she had been made to understand something he had not. By the fourth witness, the pattern was beyond denying, and the Reverend wrote it out in full. Anyone in Caudle's Branch who came to him with what they had seen on the knob was gone within days. Taken ill. Gone to kin. Drowned in the creek. Always a story, always courteous, always a vanishing with no body and no grave. The elders did not threaten him. They never raised a hand to him or a voice. They simply removed, quietly and completely, every single person who tried to tell him the truth, until the Reverend understood that he was being taught a lesson with other people's lives. The lesson was that the hollow could not be questioned, because the act of answering was itself a death. He should have gone down the creek path that day. He wrote, in an entry near the end, that he knew he should. He wrote that any sensible man would carry what he had learned to the county and let stronger forces come up the path behind him. And then he wrote the sentence that historians who have read the journal say they cannot forget, because it is the sentence of a man choosing his own end with his eyes open. But if I leave, the children will be taught that the knob won, that the gospel feared it, and that the mountain is the only God that answers in this place. I will not teach them that. I am going up to the knob on the next dark night to see for myself what is owed, and to stand against it in the open, and if I do not come down, let this book come down in my place. The journal's final entry is dated the night of the new moon, October the 3rd, 1889. It is short. He wrote that he could see the fires on the knob from his window, more than he had expected, the whole of the hollow's men gone up, and that the church building below stood dark and empty as it always did, and that he understood now that the real church of Caudle's Branch had always been up there on the high ground in the dark, and the building below was only a mask the hollow wore for visitors. He wrote that he was not afraid, which the trembling of the hand in that last line says was not entirely true. And then he wrote, "Whatever they keep up there, it has been kept a long time, and it is hungry in a patient way, and I think the men do not serve it because they wish to, but because long ago someone made the first bargain and now no one alive remembers how to stop. That is the last sentence Ephraim Tull ever wrote. He went up the knob that night. He did not come down. His journal came down in his place, exactly as he had asked. A boy of the hollow, perhaps the same boy who had first told him about the knob, carried it down the creek path in the spring and gave it to a storekeeper in the valley and said only that the preacher had told him to, and would say nothing else, and went back up into Codill's branch and was never identified again. The storekeeper passed the journal to a county official who read it and did the thing that the sheriff had already refused to undo. He filed it. There was no body. There was no crime that any court in 1890 could have tried. No living witness who would speak. No road up which the law would willingly travel. The official record of the disappearance of the Reverend Ephraim Tull runs to a single line, presumed lost in the mountains. But here is the thing the official record does not contain. The thing that came to light only decades later when a folklorist working in that county in the 1930s gathered the old stories from people whose grandparents had lived in or near Codill's branch. The folklorist's notes, now held with the journal, record a persistent local account of what was kept on the high knob, passed down in fragments. The elders did not worship the mountain, the old people said. They fed it. There was a place on the knob, a cleft in the limestone going down into the dark. And the bargain, older than anyone's memory, older than the family's, was that the hollow would prosper, that its crops would come in on poor ground and its people would be spared the sicknesses that swept the valleys, so long as on the dark nights the men brought up what was owed and gave it to the cleft. Most years what was owed was small, but in some years the cleft wanted a person, and in those years a man went up and did not come down, and the family was told he had been honored, because the alternative was to admit what their fathers had agreed to. The reverend, the old people said, had not been killed by the elders at all. The elders had not needed to lift a hand against him. He had gone up the knob to stand against the thing in the open, and the thing had simply accepted him, the way it accepted the others, because by going up he had offered himself, and the cleft does not refuse what is offered. The witnesses who vanished, the old people said, had not been murdered either. Not exactly. They had been given. Each one who tried to tell the secret was carried up on the next dark night and given to the cleft to keep the bargain whole. Because a told secret was a debt, and the mountain collected its debts in the only currency the hollow had ever paid. Today there is nothing on the high knob above Codill's branch but rock and laurel and a cleft in the limestone that the geologists who have looked at it say goes down farther than any of them have cared to measure. The hollow emptied out across the early 20th century, the way so many of them did. The young going to the mines and the cities, the old dying. The bargain, if it was ever a bargain, forgotten or abandoned or simply starved out when there were no more men to climb up on the dark nights. The paved road came in the 1950s. There is a church now with a sign that lights up, and on Sundays people fill it. And the building down by the creek that no one ever used has long since fallen in. The cleft is fenced. The fence is not to keep people out, the rangers will tell you, but to keep them from falling in, and they will tell you that no one has ever fallen in, and they will also tell you, if you press them, that they do not go up to the knob on the dark nights, and that they do not know why they have that rule, only that they have always had it. So what did the mountain elders do to the preacher who asked too many questions? Did a frightened, secretive clan murder a meddling outsider and 4 of their own neighbors, and dress the killings in a story of bargains and clefts so that they could live with their own hands? Or had Codill's branch truly been bound, long ago, to something in the rock, something that did not need the elders to kill at all, that only needed to be fed, and that took the preacher and the witnesses as freely offered debts the moment they made themselves into spoken secrets? Was the horror in that hollow a human evil wearing the mask of the supernatural, or a supernatural one wearing the mask of human evil so that no court could ever name it? The reverend went up to find out. His journal came down. He did not. And the only people who knew the answer made very sure that everyone who tried to share it joined him on the knob. This is one of the most chilling vanishings these mountains have ever closed over, and the cleft is still up there, fenced and quiet and far too deep. So I want to hear from you. Do you believe the elders of Caudille's branch were murderers hiding behind a legend, or do you believe the legend, and that the preacher's faith was offered to something that does not refuse what is offered? And would you have walked up the knob on the dark night, the way Ephraim Tull did, to stand against it in the open? Tell me below. If this story climbed up into you and you want to go further into the high places these mountains keep fenced, and the questions they punish people for asking, then stay with me and subscribe, because there are more knobs and more clefts and more journals that came down when the men who wrote them did not. Until next time, keep to the paved roads and never go up on the dark nights to find out what the mountain is owed.